So, Cassie, you'd think after doing like 40 of these over the last few years, we would have figured out how to introduce our podcast by now.
I think part of the charm is that we don't have an intro.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many people out there who are obsessed with being professional. Someone needs to really balance out the trash side of the spectrum. We're brilliant for that.
Yep, we are a pair of trash goblins.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. This is Mythillogical.
Yes, trash gobbling being an excellent linking device, considering we are a podcast that is all things mythology and folklore. And today, we're picking up kind of where we left off. I don't think we have anything to plug before I get going, do we?
No, nothing new since last...
We do, actually, which is, I know we've mentioned this on the last two podcasts now, but Cassie has finally got the YouTube channel for Folklore and Superstition off the ground. So,
yes, it's finally on YouTube.
Yeah, so everyone out there who wants to experience some more bite-sized, more bedtime story-style folklore and mythology, go and check that out over on YouTube. First episode, Merlin's Hidden Treasure, is now out and live. But those of you who've probably clicked on this episode know what you're actually here for, considering also what the last main episode of Mythological was. And we are here today to talk about werewolves again, somehow, after 3 hours.
There's still more.
Yes, somehow there is still more, and not quite as much as we had last time. But what I didn't really appreciate when we started researching this second half, because last time I think we ended up around the early modern period, talking about the first emergence of something starting to resemble the modern werewolf myth.
Yeah, 17th century or so, we left things off.
And what I didn't appreciate is the folklore does expand a lot from that point onwards. And I think we ended last time saying that we were going to do something a little bit similar to what we did for the end of our vampires episode, for people who remember that a few years back now, which was going on kind of a world tour of different werewolf traditions. That plan has not quite panned out. But the other thing, which we were planning to do, which is looking at how the more modern idea of the werewolf, as we see in pop culture these days, emerged, that should still be going ahead.
It panned out differently to what I was expecting. It's going to be interesting, folks.
Well, if it's going to be interesting, then let's just get straight on into it.
Well, references first, and then...
Yes. So for today's episode, we used a few different sources. I used quite a few of my sources are actually the same as the last time, but I'll add in the new ones. So I used the chapters Dead Bodies and Transformations, Werewolves in Some South Slavic Folk Traditions I really should have looked this name up, by Maja, Pasarić, and Estonian Werewolf History by Dr. Metsvahi in the book Werewolf Histories. I think I also used some stuff from the Differentiated Werewolf in there by Willem de Blucourt, I think his name was.
Willem de Blecot.
Blecot, okay, that's the one.
You got to put the French accent on it.
Exactly. I think he's Belgian? It might be Dutch.
I'm sorry, Belgium.
Yeah. I also used The Werewolves of Livonia, Lycanthropy and Shapeshifting in Scholarly Texts, 1550 to 1720 by Stefan Donecker. The Book of Werewolves, being an account of a terrible superstition by Sabine Baring-Gould. Werewolf and Vampires in Romania by Harry A. Sen. The Ethnogonic Tales of the Turks by Peter B. Golden. The Secret History of the Mongols, translated by Christopher P. Atwood. Tales and Traditions of the Eskimo with a sketch of their habits, religion, language, and other peculiarities by Heinrich Rink. And The Changing Shape of the Shapeshifter, the French-Canadian Loup-Garou by Amy J. Ransom.
That's a good world tour there.
It is.
Looking forward to this bit.
Well, it's like world tour, if you count a world tour as we went to Europe, part of Asia, and the Caribbean.
I mean, it's your average rock band's world tour.
Yeah. I mean, we're not far from just like a US baseball's world tour, but yeah.
Anyway, Charles, it's my references.
Yeah.
So I have quite a nice mix of references today. I've kept The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould and The Werewolf in Lore and Legend by Montague Summers. In addition to that, I've also brought in some stuff from Curiosities of Indo-European Tradition and Folklore by Walter Keating Kelly. Werewolf Legends from Germany by D.L. Ashleyman, Le Folklore de France by Paul Sebillot, Tales from the Aegean by Dimitrios Vikelas. I also have a couple of internet articles. So Werewolves, Hydrophobia and Clinical I'm going to be saying this word a lot and it's going to go wrong every time. Werewolves, Hydrophobia and Clinical Lycanthropy by Dr. Gordon Bates, the resident historian at the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And the article, Rabies' Horrifying Symptoms Inspired Folk Tales of Werewolves and Vampires by Jessica Wang on Big Think. Also, I got to be a neuroscientist for some of this episode.
Hey.
I got to read some scientific papers. So we have Clinical Lycanthropy, Neurobiology and Culture, a Systematic Review by Salim Benjamin and colleagues. By Salim Benjamin Gessam and colleagues of the Université Hôpital Cochin in Paris, published in Frontiers in Psychiatry in 2021. When Doctors Cry Wolf, a Systematic Review of the Literature on Clinical Lycanthropy by Jan Dirk Blom of the Parnassia Psychiatric Institute in The Hague, published in History of Psychiatry in 2014. Belief, Delusion, Hypnosis, and the Right Dorsolateral Prefrontal Cortex,
Wow.
a transcranial magnetic simulation study by Max Colthart and colleagues of Macquarie University in Sydney, published in Cortex in 2018. That is the most scientific terminology I've ever used on this show. And finally, Clinical Lycanthropy, Delusional Misidentification of the Self by Rajit Shrestha of North Coast Behavioral Healthcare in Ohio, published in the Journal of Neuropsychiatry and Clinical Neurosciences in 2014.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of how we split up this episode, to the best of my knowledge, Cassie, because I don't think we actually discussed this very well in advance, we're going to start off by me filling in a few little folkloric elements from the early modern period that I missed last time that I thought would be actually good to give their own little section. I thought there was actually some unique elements that they brought to werewolf mythology that we kind of glossed over last time. Then we're going to go over to you to talk about more of the emergence of the modern werewolf figure for a little while.
Yep, from the 18th century, from the 19th century, I should say, until the early 20th, and the Hollywood werewolf.
Yes. Yeah, we got to watch a couple of old Universal horror films as part of our research, in air quotes.
Oh, yes, I should have counted The Wolfman from 1941, directed by, if my iPad moves my
It's the Lon Chaney Jr. one, that's all I know.
Starring Lon Chaney Jr., and I can't find the director because my iPad's not responding to me anymore.
Oh, right, okay, great.
The Wolfman from 1941, that's my references.
Yeah, I also watched Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and I watched The Wolfman as well. Quite frankly, you didn't miss much for the one which you didn't watch there, Cassie. I can understand the retrospective reviews not being quite so favourable for Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman.
Fair.
Then after we've done that, we're going to jump back over to me again for a bit of my truncated world tour of werewolf figures. And we're going to finish off, as probably you could tell from the various neuroscience papers listed off, Cassie is going to talk about the kind of more clinical idea of lycanthropy versus the folkloric idea.
Yes, and I'm putting a bit of a content warning on the clinical lycanthropy bit because obviously there's a lot of talk of psychiatric disorders, medication, etc. So we're keeping that at the end. We'll give the sneak preview of the next episode before that in case anyone wants to duck out rather than listen to any talk of psychiatry and medical stuff.
Okay, so my original plan for how I was going to do my section of this episode when we were trying to sitting down and discussing it was, as I've said so far, I was going to do a world tour of different creatures that resemble werewolves, similar to what we did for vampires. Unfortunately, it turns out that whilst there are plenty of different creatures worldwide that meet the basic criteria of blood-sucking, nocturnal creature that can fly, usually is also undead, there are far fewer creatures where any direct parallel can be drawn to the European idea of the werewolf. I was tempted to broaden out the category to cover just general animal shapeshifters, so I could have covered some Native American figures like the skinwalkers of the Navajo and the Nagual of Mesoamerica. However, in practice, I found that I had enough to cover just by going through wolf-related folklore in the remaining parts of Europe that we didn't get to last time, along with the Caucasus and parts of Central Asia that we didn't get to either. One thing that we might want to do in the future, though, is to have a dedicated episode on different types of shapeshifters around the world. I thought that might be cool to put up as one of the future Patreon votes. I do want to note, though, that as far as I'm aware, the Navajo people really don't like outsiders discussing the concept of the skinwalker, from what I could tell. And looking around, I initially was going to try and include some of these figures. I looked around, did a bit of research, and there's not great sources on the skinwalkers available in English. So my general conclusion was that unless we can find some way of doing this in a manner that we judge to be respectful of that prohibition, it's probably not a topic that we're going to cover. We'll have to have a think about that one.
Yeah, this is one of the examples of the things we said in the Q&A of we do need to learn more about the culture in general before addressing it, because things like this are what come up. And so we do want to make sure everything is respectful.
So yeah, that's basically why we're not probably going to end up covering those figures anytime soon. So before we go into the development of the modern werewolf that we all know and love/hate, loved reading about, don't want to meet one, I want to cover a region that I briefly mentioned last time in the context of the werewolf trials of the early modern period. Whilst the werewolf lore of this region was heavily influenced by the various tales I covered in the last episode, over time it seems to develop a few of its own traditions around the creature. And this is the historical region of Livonia, which consists of modern Estonia and parts of Latvia. According to Dr. Merili Metsvahi, throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, the werewolf was considered an extremely common feature of Livonia by other parts of Europe, to the point where some sources published in places like Germany would list it as part of the common fauna of the area. Apparently it was just swimming in werewolves. Think what I said in the last episode about the Western idea that werewolves were incredibly common in Constantinople/Istanbul during the time, except that this is the more cold and stoic version. Now, we'll get into the two main works that appear to have caused this perception, but before that I want to discuss some older traditions of other figures in the region that has been argued by Dr. Stefan Donecker of the Austrian Academy of Sciences to have influenced depictions of werewolves in this region. And this is kind of going a little bit back to ancient Greek times, and it's an element that I missed last time. This element are the creatures known as the cynocephali, or the dog-headed men. These creatures first appear in early accounts amongst ancient Greek and Roman writers. So, for example, Herodotus repeats in his histories claims by the Libyans that dog-headed men lived east of their lands, along with a great many other creatures that he labels as fabulous. To be fair, Herodotus sometimes gets a bad rap for just credulously just throwing stuff out there that other people have said, but he's just like, this is literally just what I was told. That's all I'm going on here. He's not making any great... He's dubious, we should say.
Yeah, you say Herodotus gets a bad rap. That has included from us.
Yes, that's fair enough.
I think we upset some people by giving Herodotus a bad rap once.
So the most detailed accounts of these figures comes from a fragment of the work Indica by the 5th century BC author Ctesias, I think it's pronounced. Starts with a C. That was preserved by the Byzantine author Photius. Ctesias reports that men with the heads of dogs live in the mountains of India as far as the river Indus, that they clothe their bodies with the tanned skins of wild beasts, they can live up to 170 years, and that whilst they can understand human languages, they themselves are only capable of howls, or barks, I should say. He also says that they survive by hunting and rearing sheep, that they dwell in caves, and that they are extremely just and skillful warriors. This account is almost completely duplicated by the later Roman author Pliny the Elder, who claims these details come from an account by a man named Megaphanes. Similar accounts also appear in the early medieval period by authors such as St. Augustine and Isidore of Seville, who again place them in the East. According to Stefan Donecker, soon after, however, a parallel tradition emerged that places these figures instead in Scandinavia. The earliest example of this is in an either 7th or 8th century cosmographia, or a description or map of the world, that is traditionally attributed to a churchman named Hieronymus, and is known principally by the name of its protagonist, Ethicus Ister. This work places the cynocephali on an island north of Germany known as Monitia. The 11th century chronicler Adam of Bremen would describe them in his Deeds of the Bishops of the Hamburg Church as inhabiting the northern parts of the Baltic Sea, and claimed that they descended from the Amazons that once lived in the area. And the Amazons are like a whole other can of worms that we're not going to go into at this time. Might be a future topic, though, for the podcast.
Yeah.
One that we've kind of overlooked. Yeah. That same century, the Passion of Adalbert of Prague, I think was a martyr, described them as existing amongst the then pagan Prussians. So this is kind of the region like northern Poland, east of Germany in modern days. And according to Donecker, multiple 13th and 14th century works place them either in Russia, northernmost Scandinavia, or Lithuania. I wanted to mention these figures here for completeness, given that I missed them out in the last episode, but I am actually quite dubious as to whether this supposed race of men influenced the later 16th century onwards traditions of the Livonian werewolf. As Stefan Donecker notes, these figures were seen as a distinct, wondrous race that weren't aligned with the devil, as the later figure of the werewolf in the early modern period was usually accused of being. They also don't share any physical traits with the later werewolf, as far as I can tell, other than just having a canine head. Donecker does opine that it's likely the two figures didn't develop independently, but I'm honestly not really seeing what the argument is for that. I mean, I think a lot of these descriptions of the dog-headed men existing in this region are external descriptions. I didn't see any evidence that anyone there actually believed any of this. So I'm not really buying his argument. And obviously I have far less understanding of this topic than him, but yeah, I just don't see it personally. One thought I did have is that these notions could have been circulating against the nobility of Livonia at the time. That's probably the one element where I could think where it could be influencing it. Which, due to the colonization of the region and the rule of the Teutonic Order between the 13th and 16th centuries, were majority German during the time of the werewolf trial. So maybe there's a thread there that the German nobility could have transmitted this cynocephaly idea into the ideas of the werewolf legend, but no one mentions it by that name at all. It's not a name or feature that shows up in later folklore from the 19th and 20th centuries. So yeah, I don't really see the connection. So moving on to actual works that directly seem to have influenced European views of the Baltic werewolf, there are actually very few first-hand works that discuss these regions of Europe during the early modern period. This meant that the impressions of werewolves within Livonia would come to be heavily influenced by two widely popular foreign works. The first was the 1550 reprint of Sebastian Munster's Cosmographia, in which he wrote that, quote, "In this land there are many sorcerers and witchwomen, who adhere to the erroneous belief, which they have often confessed before court, that they become wolves, roam about and cause harm to all they encounter. Afterwards they transform back into human shape. Such people are called Werewolf." The second is the Swedish priest Olaus Magnus's 1555 work, Historia de Gentibus this is a struggle of a name. Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus.
That's a mouthful.
Let me try that again.
Well done.
Septentrio. Well, I'm gonna try and get it. Okay. Septentrionalibus. There we go.
It could be completely wrong. I don't know why I'm applauding.
I think it's Latin, so usually we're okay about usually getting the grammar right for Latin. Or to give the English language version of the copy I found, a compendious history of the Goths, Swedes, and Vandals and other northern nations. I thought that this work was worth going into in detail because it lists some elements of werewolf lore that I hadn't heard from any of the accounts we talked about in part 1. According to Magnus, werewolves were a bigger threat in Livonia than actual wolves. They had a habit of gathering around Christmas when they would attack both animals and people. In what I think we can all agree is a far worse antic, though. They also had a nasty habit of breaking into cellars and drinking all the beer that they found.
How dare they?
Yeah. I can forgive brutal mauling, but I draw the line at nicking my ale.
Killed people for nicking my beer. I haven't. For legal reasons.
Allegedly. Allegedly. Not even allegedly. Interestingly, these creatures would also congregate for a big annual event each year in a set of ruins on the border between Lithuania and Curonia, where several thousand werewolves were said to gather. Here they would compete to jump over a wall, and those that had grown too fat to be able to accomplish this were beaten with a whip by their leader. Though sadly, I have to report that in addition to all the murdering and beer stealing, werewolves in this region were also fat shamers.
I really don't like these werewolves.
No. So one interesting aspect of werewolf lore that Magnus also reports from this region relates to how these werewolves were created. Rather than becoming a werewolf through a deal with the devil, or being given a magic item that allows them to transform into a wolf, as was a feature of the German and French stories we discussed last time, often it was like a belt or a girdle to refresh people's memories.
That will come up again.
According to Magnus, people became werewolves in Estonia through a method that, to balance out all the negative antics they've done so far, this is a more pleasant way to become a werewolf. So the way that you make someone a werewolf in Livonia is you share a mug of beer with them, and whilst they drink the beer, you recite a specific spell, and that turns them into the werewolf.
I can get on board with that.
It's better than just being randomly mauled,
yeah.
I will say. Hey, free beer. I think we can all say that this objectively beats getting bitten or having some guy just hand you a spooky girdle, though. So both of these accounts would be highly influential, and according to Austrian historian Stefan Donecker, most accounts of Livonia throughout the next 150 years would not fail to mention werewolves in some fashion. According to both Dr. Metsvahi and Donecker, the fact that Livonia was heavily associated with war during this time may also have played a role in cementing this perception. So we talked last time about how many of the other European werewolves took place during times of mass conflict and devastation, such as during the 30 Years' War and the French Wars of Religion, during which wolves were heavily abundant, because everyone's fighting, no one's population controlling the wolves, and also battlefields, bodies, lots of stuff to eat for the wolves. So Livonia is no exception in this regard, and in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was a centre of almost constant conflict between the regional powers of Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, and Muscovy, which later became Russia. A particular high point of this conflict was the Livonian War of 1558 to 1593, which saw mass devastation of the country. So in terms of Livonian werewolf trials, many of the details are similar to those found in the German and French trials that we covered in more detail last time. There are still a few more unique features though. So for example, in this region, women were much more commonly accused of being werewolves in these trials than men. Dr. Merili Metsvahi attempts to link this to women in Livonian society historically having far greater autonomy and power than in those other areas prior to the imposition of Christianity from the 13th century onwards. I don't know enough about the region to really judge that claim or not. Similarly, in most of the folk tales that Metsvahi relates in her chapter, the werewolf is in fact a transformed woman. When it came to the details of the trials themselves, in some cases people are known to have given stories where they admitted to having some sort of magical ability, but claimed that it was actually benign or positive. So this is like during their initial interview stages. So for example, according to Stefan Donecker, in 1691, an 86-year-old man known only as Old Fierce was accused of being a werewolf and put on trial. At this trial, he fully admitted to being a werewolf and seems to have been very proud of it, declaring that he and his fellow werewolves were actually the hounds of God, who greatly opposed the devil and who ensured the prosperity and fecundity of the land. This led to a completely farcical situation where the judges suspected that he was actually just senile rather than a werewolf, whilst Fierce was doing his best to convince them that, no, I'm a werewolf, I'm a werewolf.
So it's more far-fetched that he be a godly werewolf and they assume must be senile than he be a devil-influenced werewolf.
That apparently was the situation, yes. So according to Dr. Metsvahi, in some cases the defendants were then tested by being thrown in a body of water, as the usual witch trial method. I've realised, I think we've said a couple of times on this podcast what the actual witch testing was, but we've not actually ever said what that actually involved, because people think, oh, you throw someone in the water and if they float...
If she weighs the same as a duck.
Yes, I know. I was trying to avoid that. But like...
I'm leaning into it.
Yeah, I think the perception of a lot of people is like they just dunk people in water and if they float, they're seen to be witches. But the detail that I think I found was what they would actually do is they would tie someone up, they would attach a line to them, and then they'd throw them in the water. And if they sank, they were innocent, and they'd pull them back out.
Oh, they did actually let the innocent ones live.
Yeah, they didn't. I don't think that it was actually like the perception of, if you drown, you're innocent, you go to heaven. If you survive, you're a monster, we kill you.
Yeah, because that was how it was always explained to me. That like you're doomed either way.
I might have to look into, double check where I got a source for that one, because I didn't write down my source for that. But that was my perception looking around. It's not what people think, basically.
Things weren't as bad as we thought.
Yeah.
Then. Wow, that's a new one.
In other cases, people were tortured, which often unsurprisingly led to them changing their stories significantly. For example, a man named Hen of Nossi made the statement that he only used magic to heal people before a court, but after torture, he admitted to knowing spells that could harm and to having put on a wolf skin. On the whole, though, there only seems to have been about 30 documented people who were actually accused of practicing lycanthropy, and from the mid-17th century, not all of the people who ended up being accused were actually condemned to death. I don't want to rehash any of this further, as basically a lot of these trials are pretty similar to the ones that we discussed last time in detail. So instead, what I'm going to try and do here is focus on some of the more folkloric accounts that were collected from Estonia during the 19th and early 20th centuries. I know this is kind of sort of breaking the chronological order that we followed in part 1 up until this point, but I figured it was best to include them in this section rather than coming back after your next section, Cassie. So in form, these folk tales are very clearly influenced by the wider European idea of a werewolf that emerged in the early modern period. As Dr. Metsvahi notes, these notions were likely picked up from the Germans, but this transfer was eased by the fact that the Estonians likely had their own pre-existing concepts of people shape-shifting into animals. So, for example, in the folk story, The Song of the Fish Maiden, of which both Estonian and Finnish Karelian versions exist, and I think a version of which also appears as part of the compiled Finnish national myth of the Kalevala. This song concerns a brother who goes out and catches a fish one day, but upon bringing it home and cutting it open, he discovers the beads, chaplet, brooch, or apron that belongs to a maiden inside it, implying that he has actually killed a woman who was transformed into a fish. This element of items being found under the skin of the slain creature is one that also appears in Estonian werewolf lore. So, for example, according to a tale by Jacob Hurt in the 1890s, a village in the Seto region was menaced by a werewolf which killed no one but kept the whole settlement in fear. Eventually the beast was shot, but when the villagers began to skin it, they found a large bridal brooch and beads under the skin. From that day on, no one from the village dared to kill any more wolves. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any longer form examples of this type of tale in English. I'm almost entirely reliant on Dr. Metsvahi's chapter here for these. Thankfully, she does also document a couple of longer folk tales, however, that I'm going to quickly share here. So the first of these tales was collected in a 19th century travelogue by Christian Hieronymus Justus von Schlegel, which might be the most German man who ever lived. He worked in Estonia as a private tutor between 1780 and 1782. I had a look around to see if there was an English translation of his travelogue, whose name roughly translates to Travels in Several Russian Provinces in 1801, 1807, and 1815, but as it didn't seem to exist, I'm going to just have to go with the version given by Dr. Metsvahi in her article. By the time that he would have been travelling as well, I should say the Russian Empire was ruling these parts of Europe. So the main reason I chose to include this story in particular is that at the time I was writing this down, I thought it might be the earliest tale I know of to use the motif of killing a werewolf using a silver bullet. Only for you, Cassie, to tell me, you think you found one that's even older?
Give me the date again of that one. Sorry.
It'd be the early 19th century.
Roughly contemporary then, I think, the one I have. Oh no, I do have one from the 18th century.
Okay, yeah, so probably that one's probably earlier then. So in this tale, we are told that one winter there were more wolves around the parishes of Torma and Lias in eastern Estonia than usual. These wolves were said to have come from Russia by running over the frozen ice of Lake Peipus, and that they had no fear of humans, ignored livestock, and preyed exclusively on people. Many people failed to catch the wolves, until eventually a German hunter decided to track them down. He loaded up 2 guns, one which he loaded with a normal bullet, and one which he loaded with a silver bullet, claiming it could be used to shoot the devil himself. He found the wolves, and one of them, with 2 black spots on its chest, attacked him. The hunter shot at it with one of the guns, but it had no effect, and even after he reloaded and fired the same gun again, it continued to have no effect. He then took up the other gun with the silver bullet and shot the beast just as it leapt at him. The wolf fell down dead and proved so heavy that the hunter invited the other residents of the region to come and skin it where it fell. When they cut off the beast's skin, however, they discovered inside a dead woman, who apparently had turned herself into a wolf using witchcraft. This last element reminds me somewhat of the story, was it the Werewolf of Ossory?
Yes.
That you discussed?
Island, yeah.
It's kind of a curious parallel, but it's so separated by time and space, I'm not sure if there's any actual link there.
Yeah. For those who don't remember, the Werewolves of Ossory were turned into, 2 of them were turned into wolves as punishment for the evil deeds of people, and one of whom was a dying old woman who was given last rites and had her skin basically torn off, her wolf skin torn off to reveal the human skin during her last rites.
So the second story I have was again provided by Dr. Metsvahi and exists in at least 35 different versions that have been collected in different parts of Estonia. According to the earliest known version, which was collected by J.B. Holsmeyer in 1873, 2 girls from a village were heading to the manor of Reo to work there. On the way, they passed the manor's paddock, and one of the girls commented on how fat the foals had become from grazing. At this point, the other girl said that as they had arrived too early, they should instead lie down for a sleep before going into work. The first girl agreed, but she only pretended to be asleep. Thinking that her companion was snoring soundly, the other girl did 3 somersaults and turned into a wolf. As the first girl watched from a bush, she killed the fattest of the foals and ate it, drinking its blood, then stored some of the meat in her box. The first girl then ran back and pretended to be asleep again, and thinking that she was sound asleep, the wolf did 3 more somersaults and turned back into a girl. She woke up the first girl and they proceeded to the manor. There the second girl offered the first girl some of the meat from her box, but the first refused, telling her to eat it herself. The second girl grew angry, and she threw the meat in her companion's face, which somehow had become so hot that it burned her. So that's like a motif I've not seen anywhere else in my research, the idea of like meat claimed by a werewolf will just like cook itself.
Yeah, I've not seen that at all.
No.
For these whole 2 episodes, actually.
So that's my little section, filling in that part of the map when it comes to werewolf lore. And I'm now going to pass over to Cassie to tell us now how the modern werewolf archetype emerged. But before we do that, we're just going to take a moment to listen to some fine products and/or services. Enjoy.
Thank you, Charles. So yes, we're moving back into Central and Western Europe for now. So last episode in this region, you left off in around the end of the 17th century.
Yeah, it's about
more or less. So I'll be picking up the story from the 18th century. So by this time, the witch hunts that had given rise to werewolf trials were dying down in Britain and mainland Europe. Werewolf superstitions did persist, but they were generally seen now in more rural areas where the very real threat of regular wolves remained, and they didn't result in quite as much persecution of suspected werewolves. In Britain and in Ireland, werewolf superstition died down entirely as real wolves had been driven to extinction at that point. So, for this section, I'm going to cover the variety of werewolf beliefs that existed in Central and Western Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. From there, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to the rise of the Hollywood werewolf, made popular by the Wolfman movie, as we mentioned earlier, and ask if any of what we see in the modern werewolf had its origin in superstitions that we hadn't already covered, or where we have mentioned potential links, expand on them further if I can. So I'm going to start out in Germany, officially the German Confederation for much of the time period that this section will be covering. Much of the information on werewolves in Germany I initially found in Curiosities of Indo-European Tradition, the 1863 book by Walter Keating Kelly. So Kelly devotes a chapter of his book to werewolves, covering a lot of what we discussed last episode in ancient Greece, in the Norse sagas, and in medieval Ireland, before discussing more contemporary to him beliefs in Europe. In his werewolf section, he almost entirely cites the whole section Wilhelm Hertz's 1862 book, Der Werwolf. Many of the stories which he attributes to Hertz, I have then managed to find translated into English in the compilation Werewolf Legends in Germany that I mentioned in my references by D.L. Ashleyman. And Ashleyman cites their original authors, which include names like Karl Linker, Adalbert Kuhn, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, for one of them, and J.D.H. Tem.
Yeah, I came across, I think there's a very small number of werewolf stories in the works, the Brothers Grimm. I think it's Deutsche Sagas, I think it appears in, rather than the more famous, their more famous work.
Yeah, Deutsche Mythology is the one.
That's the more famous one.
Yeah, we've cited Deutsche Mythology before, but yes, I think it's Deutsche Sagas, these ones.
What I remember of them, they're just kind of generic werewolf stories. They're nothing that spectacular, are they?
Yeah, I don't think I mentioned any of these ones specifically when I'm telling them in more detail.
Because I was going to mention mine, but I decided no, there's nothing. Yeah. There's nothing that interesting about their stories. In that one. It's just like 3 little tiny stories, and that's it. Yeah,
but it's worth noting that the Brothers Grimm did include a few, even if they're not the more notable stories in themselves.
Yeah.
So as you just mentioned, Charles, and as we talked about last time, German werewolf beliefs seem to take some influence from the Norse sagas that we discussed and had been evolving since the 16th century to involve the main method of transformation being a garment made of wolf skin, which is specifically a girdle or belt made with 7 fastenings, which is much more practical than the whole wolf skin as Sigmund and Sinfjotli wore in the Volsung saga. This method, of course, offered an advantage that one could transform at will as long as one had the girdle, and that, in theory, anyone could use it. Despite the transformation being a willing one and being reversible, the werewolves did not seem to keep their own minds when transformed, and so would often require a trusted person to prevent them from harming their own family or their own livestock, and to remove the girdle and reverse the transformation. This also provided an obvious weakness when threatened by a werewolf, in that anyone who recognised them as a werewolf and was brave and capable enough to do so could remove or cut the girdle and return them to human form. The first example I have of such a story, which is attributed to J.D.H. Tem in 1839, is of a man from the village of Hindenburg who would transform into a wolf so strong that he was capable of carrying off an entire ox. He would feast on cattle when transformed, and he would even eat humans, but he had taught his wife magic words which would freeze him in his wolf form, preventing him from ever harming her. After using the magic words on the wolf, she could then unbuckle his belt, and he would revert to his human self. A few stories tell of people who unknowingly donned a werewolf belt and were immediately transformed and seized by a great hunger, and were only stopped by the bravery of their companions or family. For example, one man who bought the contents of a bankrupt man's house tried on a wolfskin belt that he found, and his friend had to chase after him and cut the belt with a sword after he had transformed into a wolf before he could harm anyone. A similar story, told by Adalbert Kuhn, talks about the town of Steiner in Bavaria, which tells of a young boy who found his father's werewolf girdle, unknowingly put it on, and was transformed. Fortunately, due to his youth, he was not able to adapt well to the change, and he lumbered off very clumsily, so his father could quite easily catch up with him and remove the belt. This is an important lesson. Always keep your werewolf belts in locked cabinets.
I mean, if you're going to have one, it's the same like when people in the US have guns and stuff. It's like, keep it locked in the cabinet at all times.
Yeah, I was not going to explicitly mention that, but
Use your werewolf powers responsibly, people.
Make sure it's licensed.
Yeah.
Keep it in a locked cabinet. Don't let the kids near it.
Yeah.
There is an interesting and quite grisly variant on this theme that instead of a wolf skin, this girdle could supposedly be made from the skin of a criminal that's been hanged and would have had the same effect of transforming one into a wolf. Kelly claims that the Norse word varga, or wolf, would be used as a descriptor for outlaws. So this might trace back to the idea that I discussed in the previous episode of Norse berserkers and Ulfhethnar living as outlaws and giving rise to the connection between outlaws and wolves. However, Kelly doesn't give any stories or citations to back up either of those claims. As well as the removal of the wolf belt, there is another simple weakness that these German werewolves supposedly had, which is being called by their Christian name. So a story told by Karl Linker in 1854 tells of a farmer in Hessen whose wife would serve large quantities of fresh meat for dinner every evening without telling him where she procured it. After months and months of asking, she finally agreed to let her husband see how she acquired the meat, but only if he promised that while she was working, he would not call her by her Christian name. So she took him to a field of sheep, which presumably was not their own, where she donned a wolf belt and transformed, leaping upon the sheep and carrying one off in her jaws. However, the shepherd, who had not left his flock for the night, saw this happening and pursued the wolf with dogs. The farmer, scared for his wife, called out to her by her name, Margaret, and she immediately transformed back into a human. In some cases, even recognizing a wolf without naming them was enough, as in one story of another farmer who was able to recognize a werewolf as his mother, and in addressing her as mother, she reverted to her human form. One of the other ways to defeat a werewolf, according to Adalbert Kuhn in 1859, was to throw a piece of iron or steel over them, which immediately reverses the transformation. Kuhn says this is called making blank, and it appears to be related to superstitions about blocking a witch's magic with iron.
Yeah. It's also a bit similar to the idea of the cold iron and the fae and things like that.
Yeah, it's one of a common thread that runs through quite a lot of supernatural stories of iron blocking magic or supernatural abilities. The transformation in this case, after being bound with iron, is somewhat gruesome. The wolf's pelt, quote, bursts crosswise at its forehead, and the naked human emerges from underneath the wolf's skin as it falls off. In 19th century France, we instead see that werewolf beliefs remained connected to the devil. Rather than being able to transform at will, werewolves were compelled by the devil to do so. This compulsion followed the same process in a few similar stories that were told by Paul Sébillot in Folklore de France. In the night, the werewolf would be seized by the compulsion to run, and so would jump out of their window and run to a fountain or a well. They would submerge themselves in the water, at which time the devil would cover them with a wolf's skin. They would emerge in wolf form and spend the night roaming the fields hunting before returning to the fountain that they transformed in, where they would shed their wolf skin and then return to their beds before sunrise. Sébillot also mentions other associations between werewolves and water. So he tells a story of a young man in Picardy who every Saturday would leave his clothes under a bush, roll in the mud of a pond, and in doing so transform into a werewolf. Sébillot also refers to two stories of werewolves that have more human-like traits, one which he calls the Night Lavou from Upper Brittany, and one called the Gaillou of Gironde, both of whom apparently would beat water like a washerwoman and would speak enough human speech to invite passers-by to approach them. Those who approached, they would kill, but anyone carrying a blessed object were invulnerable to them. So now we've talked quite a bit about different wolf shapeshifters over the centuries. We're up to the 19th century, and so far, with a few small exceptions, most of what we discussed has borne quite little resemblance to what I'm calling the Hollywood werewolf.
Yeah, because the main thing we've got at the moment is just transformation into a wolf. That's all. There's not werewolves created by being bitten. There's no association with the moon or wolfsbane or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. And one mention of a silver bullet so far, though I have some more coming up. So yes, you have basically just defined the Hollywood werewolf.
Right.
There, Charles, thank you. So yes, I was about to skip forward and define it using an earlier example. Because the popularity of the modern werewolf, the Hollywood werewolf, in horror movies can basically be attributed to the movie The Wolfman, starring Lon Chaney Jr. as Larry Talbot, the titular Wolfman, and with horror icon Bela Lugosi in a supporting role as the werewolf who bit him.
Yeah, I made a joke on Blue Sky that film has the most appropriate casting in the world because it stars Bela Lugosi as Bella.
Yeah. We could not think up another Romani name for him, so we just gave him his own name. It also stars Claude Rains of the Invisible Man fame. Oh, right. Though Charles has completely forgotten this fight, that shows how well Claude Rains did anything.
Well, I've not seen The Invisible Man, so I don't know.
Of course.
Yeah. I will say, if you want my potted review of that film, basically, I think it is we both have quibbles with the what's considered ethical at the time. That film. That film is entirely carried by Lon Chaney Jr.'s performance, I will say.
Ignore his treatment of women for the first 15 minutes or so. It's creepy.
It's the sort of film where, to spoil an 80-something-year-old film, the opening way he meets his love interest, who's not quite a full love interest in the film, is he accidentally spies on her with a telescope.
He accidentally spots her, but then continues spying, shall we say.
With a telescope.
There was the point where it was accidental and he could have stopped, and then he carried on.
Yeah. Then he goes to see her, pretends that he's psychic because he knows details from inside her bedroom because he's been spying on her. And then later on is oh yeah, I was spying on you, by the way, but it's all right. It's fine.
Yeah. If I hadn't been watching for the podcast, I would have just abandoned the movie at that scene.
But it's one of not to harp on too long on this, but the one thing I will say about that film is it's a film where very few of the characters have personalities. There's 3 people who have good personalities in it, but everyone else is just, I'm a policeman. I'm doing policeman things. We will need to go over there. Yes, let's go over there. We are now over there.
Yeah, Claude Rains' personality is invisible in it.
But Lon Chaney Jr. does give a great performance of a man who's internally horribly conflicted over what he's turning into.
Yeah, he very much carries that film. And to go back to a bit more description after our review of that, it was not the first major werewolf motion picture. It's probably the most influential, But it was preceded by Werewolf of London in 1935, which was where the title of An American Werewolf in London was originally inspired by. I've not watched that one. It wasn't as much of a hit, but it did bring in one element that I'm going to mention in a minute. The main character of the Wolfman did also join the original cinematic universe, a shared universe of classic horror monsters, which includes Frankenstein's monster and Dracula, for a series of popular but probably not very good movies from what you've told me, Charles. But much as Dracula defined many attributes of the modern vampire, the Wolfman essentially did the same for the modern werewolf.
Yeah.
The first Wolfman movie popularized two major aspects that make the definitive modern werewolf. Firstly, that becoming a werewolf is a curse or an illness that is inflicted by surviving a bite from another werewolf. Secondly, that to kill a werewolf, a silver weapon must be used. So in the case of the original Wolfman film, it was a silver-headed cane that was used as a bludgeon, though the Romani woman who was the mother of Bella the werewolf told Lon Chaney Jr. about the werewolf law that silver bullets or a silver knife were also
anything silver
affected. So
that can be used as a weapon.
anything silver. The third aspect that makes up the Hollywood werewolf that we've just mentioned, that a werewolf will transform on or around the night of the full moon, was not part of the first Wolfman film. Instead, the transformation occurs, to quote, when wolfsbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. The full moon as a trigger for a transformation was seen in Werewolf of London previously, and it was later brought into the Wolfman lore in the subsequent film, the delightfully titled Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman.
Yeah. So I'm going to have to... Well, I was the one of us who watched that film, so I'm now going to do my review of that film as well to pad the runtime. It's fine. It's just kind of a mediocre. The problem with that film is we now think of these things as like Freddy versus Jason. This monster fights this monster. And that's really not what this film is about or what it's going for. And you can kind of tell from the title, it's not Frankenstein versus the Wolfman. It's Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. And it is a story about the two of them mostly sort of working together. It's basically just like, the Wolfman has survived the first film. To spoil things, as Wolfman has survived the first film, he wants to find a way to die because he's a danger to everyone around him. And he's like, oh, maybe Dr. Frankenstein, who knew the secret of life and death, maybe we can find his research. And he comes across the monster, and there's like a brief scrap between them, at the very, very end. But it's an entire film of just leading up to that premise, basically. And again, Lon Chaney Jr. gives a great performance in it, equal or even better than the previous film, but it still suffers from the fact that there are even less personality in the characters than the previous film. Like the Romani woman, I forget her name, in the first film, she had an actual personality in the first film. She really doesn't in the second film. Yeah, it's fine. It's saving grace. It's only an hour long.
Also, interesting trivia: Bela Lugosi comes back as Frankenstein's monster.
But apparently I felt sorry for him because Bela had a very heavy Hungarian accent. And apparently he had lines in the original version of the film, and test audiences laughed so heavily whenever he tried to speak as the monster, they took all the lines out.
That's a bit bad.
Yeah, felt sorry for him.
Yeah. Anyway, we're not a movie reviewing podcast.
Yet.
should probably go back to Werewolves.
Yeah. Well, these doing play these films do play a role in that, but there is an element that I don't think I've seen anywhere else, which is werewolves are basically immortal, is how it works in that, where in the first film he's beaten to death in air quotes with a silver cane, but he actually survives that. He just regenerates later in a Wolverine style.
Yeah, that's where the full moon's brought in, isn't it? The light of the full moon regenerates.
Because in the first film, it's when Wolfbane is blooming. It's not when the moon is. But also, he when they put him in his coffin, and he's been in his coffin for 4 years, they heap it up with Wolfbane, and that's kind of implied to keep him in there as well. And I don't think that Wolfbane connection has really survived to modern ideas of the Wolfman as much. I don't know. I've not seen the 2010 Wolfman or I've seen Van Helsing, and it doesn't appear in that. But no.
And so from all that, the three important traits: transmission by a bite, transformation on the night of the full moon, and the only weakness being silver, became the three most famous traits of the modern werewolf. While there was one mention of a connection to the lunar cycle last episode in the medieval lore, the mention in Gervase of Tilbury's Otia Imperiala from the 12th century, It didn't explicitly mention the full moon. Charles, you didn't find any references to the full moon from the early modern period.
No.
And last episode, the other two aspects didn't come up at all. The silver bullet has come up once, and I've skipped over some silver bullet stuff just to go more into detail later. From that, that's the one where there is the most folklore backing it up. So I'm going to start on the full moon aspect. I can actually only find one story mentioning a transformation under the full moon. This is cited and told by Montague Summers, by Sabine Baring-Gould, and by Paul Sebio, all with minor variations between them, though none of them are the original source. Sebio is the only one to provide a name for his source, with Summers citing Sebio, and Baring-Gould giving no citation at all. Baring-Gould separates this version into two stories, though the elements that they cover are actually covered in a single story by Sebio. So in Baring-Gould's version, he describes the belief in the south of France that, quote, fate has destined certain men to be lycanthropists, that they are transformed into wolves at the full moon. The transformation in this case is not directly triggered by exposure to moonlight or by nightfall on the night of the full moon, as we see in modern werewolf fiction. Instead, on the night of the full moon, as I described when talking about Sebio's work just now, the men are seized by the desire to run, they jump out the window, and they find and dive into the fountain. And when they emerge, they have taken the form of wolves. Baring-Gould then goes on to refer to similar beliefs specific to the Périgord region of France, which is a region in the southwest corresponding to modern-day Dordogne department, which is east of Bordeaux in the Nouvelle-Aquitaine region. Here, these certain men who are destined to become werewolves are often born out of wedlock and are referred to as loup-les-roux. The transformation itself is the same as how Sebio describes it, though he specifies in this case that these men jump into a well, not a fountain. Despite calling them werewolves, he claims that the devil then gives them goat skins, which it doesn't make sense to me, but he insists that they are werewolves.
Okay.
They then range throughout the countryside, and Baring-Gould specifies that they eat all of the dogs that they meet before returning to human form in the same manner as the other werewolves in the morning. Montague Summers tells basically the same story, with the one change being that he says the lads are claimed to be the sons of priests, not specifically born out of wedlock. Chances are the priests weren't married, so the original descriptor does apply. At the time, France was a majority Catholic country. Catholicism had been the state religion until the French Revolution towards the end of the 18th century, so most priests would have been Catholic, and so not allowed to marry or have children, so the descriptor would still apply. Summers here cites Paul Sebio, so we go back to his book Folklore de France from 1903. Sebio gives an actual citation for his story, naming the writer from the Périgord region as Wigrin de Taillefer. I am not pronouncing that correctly. Taillefer. Taillefer? Yeah, I cannot find any way of pronouncing that. I apologize to France. This is from a book in the early 19th century called Antiquités de Vaison, which I sadly cannot find an original version for. Sebio's summary of a superstition that is described is that the sons of priests are forced at each full moon to transform themselves into werewolves in a fountain. Similar to how he describes before, they feel the urge come upon them at nightfall, jump out the window, jump into the fountain. But again, he says that these werewolves find themselves dressed in a goat skin. So it seems Baring-Gould was quoting the story accurately.
Yeah, it's just an unusual element that snuck its way into the story.
Yeah, I am completely unsure why. Goats and wolves are definitely very different animals.
Yes.
I say this as a scientist.
I mean, I have checked occasionally, so...
I've searched every source I can find for any further mentions of superstition about werewolves transforming under a full moon, and I've turned up absolutely nothing else. Transforming at night is a very common one. Some sources specify that the transformation is at midnight, but no other source mentions any specific time of the month. It seems that outside of this one small region of France, there was no superstition connecting werewolves to the full moon until Hollywood invented it.
Yeah, like it doesn't even in some of the folklore that I'm going to talk about later that was collected after that film came out, it doesn't seem to even have gotten back into that in a lot of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems that I had fallen for the misconception that it did originate in more widespread older folklore. So, I made a mistake there before when I assumed we would be finding a connection. Lycanthropy as a curse that's transmitted by a werewolf's bite also seems to be a completely non-existent trait in werewolf folklore. Montague Summers only makes one single reference to a bite transmitting werewolf-like traits, where he describes a 19th century short story by the Greek author Demetrios Vikelas. Summers mentions this in a single paragraph in his chapter on werewolves in 19th century literature, describing it as the story of a peasant who, being bitten by a mad wolf, quote, exhibits signs of lycanthropy that the fearful villagers deem uncanny, if not frankly demoniacal. To call the connection here to werewolves tenuous is being extremely generous to Summers here. I found the original story. His reference to it being traits of lycanthropy is completely made up.
Oh, okay.
The story explicitly names the condition of the peasant, whose name is Christos, names the condition as a very real disease, hydrophobia, an old name for rabies.
Yeah, I don't know if there's going to be any bleed over into that in your section later on the more medical lycanthropy.
So, I'm basically going to cover any connections relating to rabies right now, actually.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm keeping the rabies part self-contained for this. Clinical lycanthropy, completely different. So this story that Summers mentions, which has the English title of The Priest's Tale, was published in Vikelas's 1887 collection, Tales from the Aegean, and was translated into English in 1894. So I'm not going to tell the story in full detail, because only a few aspects of it are relevant, and it spends quite a lot of time describing the struggle between Christos and the rabid wolf. And much like in Cuchulainn, where I gave the content warning of the dog dies violently, it happens again here, so I'm not describing that scene at all, because there's no real need to. The book's on Internet Archive if you want to read the story in full. The plot is quite simple, and it'll sound quite familiar to you, Charles, actually, after what you've been watching. So, there's the frame story of a child asking a priest that his family are hosting if he knows anything about hydrophobia. And so the priest tells the story of a man he knew who, when tending sheep, was attacked by a rabid wolf. He survived, but he was bitten. The priest took him to hospital in Athens, despite the villagers' warning that he should instead be treated with what's called the mad plant, which is a herb that he doesn't know the name of, but claims monks in Salamis in Cyprus grow and sell. I've not found any mention of that anywhere else either. The man has his wounds treated in Athens, but when he returns to the village, the villagers are afraid of him and shun him, and he begins to develop a strong fear of going rabid himself. A few weeks later, when the villagers have begun to forget the incident, Christos developed a fever and loss of appetite. When the priest offered him a drink, Christos recoiled in disgust at it, showing the first signs of rabies. A few days later, he became delirious and violent, but his violence was limited to breaking his furniture and the possessions in his room. He never at any point in the story harms anyone, or began directly experiencing any wolf-like traits. The villagers, however, were afraid that he would jump out the window and roam through the village attacking people. Christos asked to be moved to the priest's house where he could be tended to and die peacefully, but he would not go out in the daytime due to sensitivity to light. However, that night, when the priest goes out to ensure that no one was on the street to see them, he instead sees men with guns outside the house, and he ends the story there. Having read this story and also watched The Wolfman, what's interesting to me is the similarities between how Christos reacted, knowing that he would succumb to rabies, and how Larry in The Wolfman reacted, knowing that he would become a werewolf. So both stories do put a lot of focus on the afflicted being afraid of losing himself, to the madness of rabies or to the wolf's nature, depending on which one. The reaction of the villagers, assembling an armed mob, is also quite a clear parallel, though the villagers in The Wolfman believed that the wolf was a mundane animal, and so the armed mob was not initially assembled to deal with Larry, even though that was the ultimate ending to it. There is also, of course, the obvious parallel of the scene of the victim overpowering the wolf which infected them, but being unable to avoid being bitten.
Yeah.
Given that Montague Summers was a particularly prolific writer on the supernatural in the 1930s, and his books were popular at the time that Werewolf of London and The Wolf Man were being written, it is possible that Summers' brief reference to this story and to rabies inspired the writers to look into the idea of a wolf bite further. Or it might be entirely a coincidence.
Yeah.
It is just interesting to think that one of the main features of modern werewolves has a small chance of coming from Summers making a brief reference to something that was never at any point originally connected to werewolves. Or was it? So someone with a science background who spends far too much of her life reading and talking about mythology and folklore, the similarities between the werewolf of modern cinema and the transmission, incubation, and symptoms of rabies are just too obvious for me to not go down a rabbit hole searching for any real connection there. The rabbit hole didn't deliver anything useful. I just decided there'd be a dramatic pause for the or was it. I did find quite a bit of discussion on the idea of connections between rabies and werewolf belief, including the article I cited by the resident historian of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, Dr. Gordon Bates, and an article by the University of British Columbia historian Jessica Wang, who also wrote a book called Mad Dogs and Other New Yorkers, telling the history of rabies in 19th century New York. I can't afford 35 quid at the moment for the Kindle edition of her book, so I focused on the article in which she summarised the werewolf aspect of it. So it's something I'm going to look into more just because it seems quite interesting, the history of rabies. In the article, she says that descriptions of symptoms of rabies indicated an unspoken assumption about how the disease transmitted the biting animal's essence to the suffering human. However, she does specify that 19th century American accounts of rabies never invoked the supernatural directly. She suggests that the animalistic descriptions of those suffering from what we now call furious rabies, which include descriptions like snarling like dogs, hint at folkloric beliefs of a more supernatural transference of the animal's nature as the cause of rabies symptoms, which is similar to the modern idea of transference of the curse of the werewolf in movies. But though her article is titled Rabies' Horrifying Symptoms Inspired the Folktales of Werewolves and Vampires, it doesn't really provide any evidence to back that up. It instead relies on interpretations of these descriptions in newspapers that, to me, feel more like sensationalist reporting than evidence of supernatural belief. Obviously, she is the expert on that. The book might prove that there is actually much more behind it than what I'm interpreting. So
yeah, I'm wondering, sometimes you get things as well where like people change the title of the article, like editors do things like that. But I don't know. I mean, if you can't get a concise summary of your evidence down into an article, then there probably isn't good evidence. Yeah,
I'm much more inclined to believe it's sensationalist reporting.
Yeah,
rather than any folklore here. Bates's article, which is called Halloween, Werewolves, Hydrophobia and Clinical Lycanthropy, briefly summarises all of the werewolf history that we covered last episode, describes the transmission and presentation of rabies, and then connects the two with the sentence, the parallels between an infectious disease which causes horrific transformation, aggressive madness and death, with the current myth of the werewolf in which transmission is by a contaminated bite, is readily apparent. I agree that it's readily apparent. I just said so myself.
Yeah.
I noted those just now. But again, he does not present any evidence to connect those two. Just, they look the same. There's not any evidence presented at all.
Yeah, there's no actual link.
It's, at most, any connection is Hollywood writers, again, just taking inspiration from sensational news stories seen in the 19th century, which would have been contemporary with the rise in Gothic literature and penny dreadful horror stories that also influenced horror cinema.
Like Varney the Vampire and stuff like that.
Yeah. So if you're taking influence from written material in that time period anyway, then potentially you'll be finding news articles that can sort of bleed into there. If that is a lot of words to basically say werewolf bites were not really a thing in the folklore, I'm sorry, but no one would have been happy if I hadn't have been thorough in investigating that.
Yeah, I'm about to do a similar section that is probably not going to make a few people happy, but well, at least I went into it.
Yeah, that's it. We're being thorough.
Yeah,
that's what we do.
But you know who else is also thorough? The fine products and /or services that sponsor this podcast. We'll be right back.
So finally, we come to the silver bullet, or silver weapons in general. While we've ruled out the full moon transformation and transmission by bite as major parts of werewolf folklore, the use of silver to defeat the werewolf does have quite a bit of history to it. While it was far from the only method to defeat werewolves in the 19th century, as I've shown earlier, by the early 20th century, it had become particularly common in German folktales. The earliest reference I can find is a poem from 1776 titled Der Werwolf. I'm assuming it's pronounced the W's are V's because it's German, by Johann Heinrich Voss. The poem is a short dialogue between two men, Hinz and Kunz, with Hinz describing the fearsome bestial man that he's encountered and is afraid of, and Kunz confirming that the man is a werewolf. At the end of his short section, Kunz tells Hinz how to deal with him, which reads in German, and I have practiced this, so wish me luck. Ein Silberkugelschuss aufs Fell, ein Kreuzdorn auch entwurft in schnell, which Google has translated as a silver bullet shot to the fur, a buckthorn too, de-wolfs it quickly.
De-wolf, wow, what a...
Yeah, I checked, Entwolf would only translate as de-wolfs.
Yeah.
So I assume Ent is a similar prefix to D in us.
I want to market a spray of some type, like household spray. De-wolfs 100% of houses.
I'm sure we could sell that and make a killing. Wouldn't be ethical, but we could.
It's like, you see this spray? Keeps wolves away. Yeah. How does it work? It doesn't. But look, there's no wolves around here, is there?
It's the same logic as, hey, Odin definitely killed the frost giants. Do you see any frost giants anymore?
Exactly.
In this poem, as well as silver, it did also mention a buckthorn, which is a genus of a small tree called rhamnus that's quite common throughout Europe, Asia, and America, as another weakness. But the buckthorn doesn't seem to have remained associated with defeating werewolves for very long. So the next reference that I can find, which is slightly after the reference you provided, Charles, is from 1840, another story that was compiled by J.D.H. Tem, where he tells a story that he claims took place in the 17th century in Greifswald. So if that's correct, it would predate the poem that I just quoted as well. Tem claims that a frightfully large number of werewolves terrorized the city, attacking anyone who stepped outside their houses after 8 o'clock in the evening. These werewolves were defeated by a band of students who at first found themselves powerless against the wolves. However, they gathered together all of the silver buttons that they had inherited, and they used these to kill the werewolves. I'm not sure specifically how they used them.
Guessing melt them down into bullets?
Yeah, so it could be that they melted them into musket or pistol rounds.
Yeah.
It could be that they used them as sling pellets or simply threw them, and that contact with the silver was enough. It doesn't give a description. It just says that the silver buttons were used to kill them. It's also important to note that it's specified here that the silver was inherited.
Yeah, that is another element that we haven't really touched on, that sometimes the silver can be inherited, has to be inherited.
Yeah, so it's not as common as the silver bullet itself in modern media, but some modern media does require the silver to be inherited to kill a werewolf. I personally first encountered this in the Dresden Files books, which is about a wizard in modern-day Chicago, and I had actually assumed before this that it was a modern invention to add a new layer of difficulty to killing a werewolf in the modern world. Because as a modern wizard with a lab in your basement, acquiring silver bullets is as simple as robbing a Tiffany's and melting some silver down. Silver is much easier to get hold of now, especially if you don't mind, stealing it, not buying it. So I assumed it was an extra plot device that was added to make the werewolf harder to kill again. but it seems it does have its origin in folklore. I'm not entirely sure in this case whether the original story was intended to mean that the silver had to be inherited to affect the werewolves, because I've been a student. I definitely could not afford anything silver at the time. It's quite possible that anything silver would have been effective in this case, and the inherited buttons was the only source of silver that these boys had. Whether it was the intention of the story or not for the inherited aspect to be important, it seems that the requirement for inherited silver did make it into the wider German folklore of the 19th century. For example, an 1879 account told by Karl Barsch, which is known as the Werewolf of Kleinkramz. The titular werewolf here had been disrupting hunts in the forests surrounding the town of Kleinkramz, often stealing game from within the huntsman's sights, and no bullet that the hunters fired could harm it. A travelling soldier happened upon the home of the werewolf, discovering that a young boy had found his grandmother's werewolf belt. The soldier told one of the foresters of the boy, and the forester, now understanding that the wolf was a werewolf, knew what to do. He prepared a bullet, which he made from inherited silver, and he loaded it into his rifle for the next hunt, declaring that, "Today the werewolf will not escape me." The werewolf again disrupted their hunt, and all the other hunters fired upon them to no avail. The hunter with the silver bullet succeeded in wounding the werewolf, but before the hunters could approach, they were able to flee into the village, leaving a trail of blood. The hunters followed the wolf to the boy's house and found the boy's grandmother wounded in bed, with a wolf's tail sticking out from under the covers, as she had not been able to remove the belt in her pain, so could not fully transform back. The story ends there and doesn't specify how the hunters reacted to finding the woman, whether they let her be or did something else.
That is an element occasionally get these stories. Like, they tend to resolve very abruptly.
Yeah, which did also carry on into the Wolfman.
Yeah, Wolfman.
As we discussed outside the show.
Yeah, both the Wolfman and Frank Samnick's Wolfman have incredibly abrupt endings.
Yep, just done. That's the film.
Okay,
Roll
bye.
credits. Inherited silver was also used to make bullets in the 1903 account, The Werewolf of Jarnitz, told by A. Haas. However, this time the werewolf recognized that he was in danger and begged for mercy, and so never again transformed to steal sheep as he had been doing. Regular silver that had not been specified as inherited was used in the 1921 story, The Werewolf of Husby, by Karl Mullenhoff. Mullenhoff doesn't specify a date of his story, but the bullet used is fired from a flintlock, so it suggests 19th century or earlier. This bullet doesn't kill the werewolf, but leaves her with an open wound which no doctor could treat for the remainder of her life. I think only 2 of the stories specify that the werewolves were killed, so the original one with the silver buttons and the one from Estonia that you cited, whereas all of the others de-wolfed, to use Voss's phrase, or left them permanently wounded. So with that, we've identified the 3 main traits of the Hollywood werewolf. We found that only the weakness to silver seems to have a strong case for a folkloric origin, and in the process, I think we've told everything we can on werewolf beliefs in Western and Central Europe and Scandinavia. We're not done yet. As we said earlier, like with vampires, we have some creatures from around the world with some combination of werewolf-like traits. Maybe, hopefully, something that we're crowbarring in, perhaps.
Yeah.
So I'm going to hand back to you, Charles, for the world tour.
Yeah, world tour in quotes. Okay, thank you, Cassie. Before we go further afield, I want to turn to another region of Europe that I was admittedly somewhat dismissive of in our last episode, but on further inspection does have a few bits of werewolf lore of its own. Kind of. There's a bit of a mix-up with another creature going on here that we're going to talk about. So I said last time that it's a common misconception that the werewolf originated in Eastern Europe, and that in reality our earliest folktales from this region date from after the European werewolf trials. In response to this, a number of commenters on various platforms pointed out that there are creatures in southeastern and Eastern Europe that are considered werewolves in the local folklore. However, my previous statement still stands, because yes, while some of these tales could well reflect much earlier traditions, most of the less ambiguous written accounts we have date from between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the actual number of unambiguous accounts is very small. So this is my official I'm apologizing for nothing section. This means that we can't be sure how much of these accounts reflect earlier beliefs or how much they may have been influenced by the early modern period ideas of the werewolf in places like neighbouring Germany and Italy. I personally think some elements of them are probably older, but the main reason is that these elements appear to become intermingled with older ideas about vampires in the region. I don't personally think there is a pre-existing strain of werewolves from before the 19th and 20th centuries that we can find. This mingling, however, did result in some unique takes on the creature, which often emphasize its links with the undead more than elsewhere in Europe and draws potential parallels to figures such as revenants, which I'm sure we'll talk about some other time. So the werewolf in air quotes is known by a wide variety of different names throughout southern Slavic folklore. As we mentioned way back in our vampires episode, a common name for either a werewolf or a vampire in the region is the vukodlak, or its different variants, which include vukozlak, volkolak, vovkulak, vilkodlak, and many others. It's kind of similar to all the different variants of Baba Yaga that we discussed. According to Maja Pasarić's article, Werewolves in Some South Slavic Folk Traditions, there has been significant arguments as to the origins of this figure, like the more modern figure. We talked about some of the more developmental myths in our vampires episode. Some hold it to have developed from older werewolf legends into instead a more recognizably vampiric figure, whilst others such as Willem de Blucourt in his chapter The Differentiated Werewolf in the same book argue that these werewolf elements are weak and likely the result of later influence from German sources. After seeing the descriptions that Pasarić gives, I personally think that this creature far more closely resembles the vampires that we detailed extensively in our episode. For example, these creatures are mainly created when someone is cursed by a pre-existing vukodlak, and after death they rise from the dead, attack people and animals, and suck their blood. Elsewhere, some people are considered to be born as these creatures, and are marked by having a body mainly comprised of bones, red-pointed teeth, which cause their mother's breasts to bleed whilst feeding, and sometimes as having been wrapped in a veil or cowl when born. So these creatures also do feature the ability to shapeshift, which may sound like a werewolf element, but the difference is that they actually will morph into a wide variety of different domestic creatures, and this only rarely includes the wolf, as far as I can tell. So there are various magical defenses against these creatures, but the most effective way of killing them is either to stab them through the heart or to otherwise pierce their body with a hawthorn stick, which, again, another familiar element of vampire mythology rather than werewolves. So I'm personally satisfied that this creature falls under the umbrella of vampires more than werewolves. There are a few elements I was able to come across from more recent folklore, from 19th century onwards, from this part of the world, that do resemble werewolves more closely, though, and I thought it would be fun to share here. For example, in the 19th century, the folklorist Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould's work, the Book of Werewolves that you discussed, Cassie, describes the Greek werewolf in much more recognizable terms. According to his work, the Greek werewolf is created when the lycanthropist falls into a catatonic trance, allowing his soul to leave his body. This soul then enters the body of either a wolf or a raven and searches for blood. When the soul returns to the body, the lycanthropist is then left exhausted. So this element of being able to turn in, like a vampiric figure, being able to turn into a wolf, is actually a part, I think, of Bram Stoker's Dracula, from what I remember. So there is some crossover there, but I tend to still see these as being somewhat different creatures. So following on from what I said, when these lycanthropists die, they become fully fledged vampires that often take the form of either a wolf or a hyena that sneak onto battlefields and suck the blood of dying men. So it's always sucking the blood, as far as I can tell. Elsewhere, Baring-Gould also describes the Serbian vukodlak in terms that meld both vampires and werewolves. So here he describes these beasts as wearing wolf skins and ranging abroad during the depths of winter. Once a year they hold a gathering where they strip off their skins and they hang them on the trees around them. If anyone is brave enough to seize one of these skins and burn it, then the creature will be disenchanted, though he doesn't specify whether this means it dies or that it simply turns back into a regular human. The folklorist Harry A. Sen also reports a number of Romanian werewolf motifs from the 1970s in his work Werewolf and Vampire in Romania. Here he reports that a werewolf, also known as a tricolisi or a pricolisi, can accidentally be created by having sexual relations on Christmas or Easter Eve, or if a birth takes place on Easter itself. As within Serbia, these creatures mostly appear during the winter, though a secondary period of activity is noted to take place between Easter and the Pentecost. Many of these specific stories he reports fall into something of a Europe-wide motif in more recent werewolf folklore I don't think we've really discussed here before, which according to Willem de Blucour in The Differentiated Werewolf is known as the werewolf husband. So to give an example of this type of story from the appendices that he includes, one day a man and his wife were working in the hay. Unknown to his wife, the man was a tricolisi, and he said that he had to go off somewhere. He came back as a wolf and attacked her. The woman successfully fought the wolf off, but it ripped her clothing. Later, the man returned. His wife asked him where he had been and told him that she had been attacked by a wolf. The man laughed at this, and as he laughed, she saw the threads of her clothing in his teeth. So this is the main element of how they're caught out, is the threads in their teeth. The woman immediately left her husband and married someone else, and we are told that no one ever heard anything of the husband again. So at least there was some resolution to that story. Interestingly, this motif sort of makes it into one of the most famous and influential werewolf stories, the Wolfman that we mentioned before, but in a much more tragic way, with the main character being doomed to know that his love interest was going to be the next victim. So he sees like a pentagram on her hand. That's how he marks out his next victim. Elsewhere in Eastern Europe, Baring-Gould also has a few more tidbits to share with us. He tells us that the Belarusian werewolf is a man who has incurred the wrath of the devil, who transforms him into a wolf and sends him amongst his relatives. However, this werewolf is a surprisingly amiable beast who does no harm to anyone so long as he is adequately fed. So you're basically just cursed to be a dog.
There's worse curses.
Yeah.
You don't have to go to work.
Yeah. The only downside, though, is that this creature is afflicted by an irresistible wanderlust, and as a result, it does not stay in one house or hamlet for long. I assume it travels between the houses of its various relatives, then, or something like that. Similarly, in Russia, he claims that one can become a werewolf by finding a hewn-down tree in a forest, stabbing it with a copper knife, then walking around it and repeating an incantation. The man then jumps thrice over the freeze stump and is transformed into a wolf. So that's a slight parallel there with the Estonian story I mentioned of the 3 somersaults, where you have to jump 3 times over something. And for the sake of completeness, Baring-Gould also provides us a very small story of claimed werewolves in Armenia. This story apparently came from the 1854 work Transcaucasia, Sketches of the Nations and Races Between the Black Sea and the Caspian by Baron August van Haxhausen. The actual story is short enough that I can just quote it in full. A man once saw a wolf, which had carried off a child, dash past him. He pursued it hastily, but was unable to overtake it. At last he came upon the hands and feet of a child, and a little further on he found a cave in which lay a wolf's skin. This he cast into a fire, and immediately a woman appeared, who howled and tried to rescue the skin from the flames. The man, however, resisted, and as soon as the hide was consumed, the woman vanished into the smoke. This is where my sources start to kind of break down a bit, and this is going to be a recurring theme for the rest of my section, unfortunately. On the subject of Armenian werewolves, I did come across repeated mentions online that this creature is known as a Mardegail. Unfortunately, I did not find anything even close to a reputable source for this information. The only place that had more than a brief description was a site called People of Ar, as in AR, as in Armenia, which I think is an Armenian nationalist site. That from one brief glance seems to also peddle in a bunch of pseudo-history. So I'm going to hurriedly move on from that one. I want to mention it just so that no one calls me out on not mentioning it, though. There are also a bunch of details about supposed Armenian werewolves on the Wikipedia page for werewolves. Unfortunately, though, the only source that actually cites is the fables of Mikitar Gosh, who was an Armenian author from the late 12th and early 13th centuries. I, however, been through a translated version of his works, the exact version that they translated, for all 200 pages of it, and it is not in there. So I'm not going to repeat any of them here because I have no idea if any of that is true. But you know what is true? The fine advertisers who sponsor this podcast. I don't think anyone suspects so far that I completely forgot to do any ad breaks during the original recording of this show, and I had to do them all again in post. And as long as I don't accidentally edit this speech in, no one will be the wiser. Anyway, enjoy these adverts. Another set of stories that has some parallels to European werewolf stories comes to us from Central and Eastern Asia and consists of the origin myths of the first Turkic Khaganate. This is where I'm kind of hitting that border of like, does this really count as a werewolf story? But it's interesting. We're never going to have an excuse to talk about this ever again. So here we go. For anyone unfamiliar, the first Turkic Khaganate was the empire that did what the Mongol Empire did before the Mongol Empire was a thing, in terms of the geographic territory it held, although it wasn't quite as successful. This empire first rose to prominence out of Mongolia in 552 and consisted of a core union of 30 tribes led by the Ashina clan. Over the next few decades, the Khaganate conquered lands ranging from the borders of Manchuria to the east to the Pontic steppes and Crimea in the west in southern Ukraine. Over time, though, it would slowly split into western and eastern halves, the latter of which would be temporarily conquered by the Chinese Tang dynasty in 630. The Eastern Khaganate would then revive in the late 7th century, and both halves would continue to exist into the mid-8th century. So unfortunately, we don't have first-hand accounts of these myths from people living in the Turkic Khaganate itself. Instead, they come to us by the way of a number of different Chinese accounts, specifically those collected by the Western Wei and Northern Zhou dynasties. Neither of these dynasties controlled all of China, which was then in a period of fragmentation known as the Northern and Southern dynasties. So the earliest surviving of these tales, known simply as Wolf Tale 1, was recorded in a work known as the Zhoushu, which is an official history of the Northern Zhou dynasty. Zhou is like transcribed in ZH in most English texts, but it's kind of a word that Anglophones really struggle with. It's like I've heard versions where it's Zhou, Cho, Zhou, that kind of different versions of it. This work was written, I believe, under either the Sui or Tang dynasties later on by an individual known as Linghu Derfan. According to the tale, the ancestors of the Ashina Turks lived on the Western Sea, which according to Peter Golden, exactly which sea this is, we aren't exactly sure. It could be several different seas across Asia or even in Eastern Europe. These ancestors were attacked and slain by a neighbouring state, and only a 10-year-old boy survived. The enemy soldiers didn't have the heart to kill him, so instead they cut off his feet and threw him into a grassy swamp, which I believe is what's technically called killing him.
Yeah. Didn't have the heart to kill him, we're just going to make him suffer.
Yeah, we're just going to kill him in a much worse way. So here he was found by a she-wolf who fed the boy meat. So very Romulus and Remus, as myths go. And we're going to hit another one of those later on as well.
Ooh, fun.
However, this myth then goes in a controversial new direction. I think we can call it bold. Some people might call it bit dodgy. Quote, he grew up and had relations with the she-wolf, who became pregnant. Anyway, when the kingdom of the neighbouring state discovered that the boy was still alive, he sent out men who killed him. The she-wolf managed to escape and hid in a cave beneath a mountain in Turfan, which is now in the modern Xinjiang region. So Western China. Oh, well, there's some debate as to whether they want to be part of China, but hurriedly moving along. On the other side of this cave was a huge grassy plain, surrounded on all sides by mountains. Here she gave birth to 10 sons, who later grew up and left to marry normal women. One of these men took Ashina as his family name, and after some generations, their descendants became subjects of the Ruru or Rurans, and they settled near the Altai Mountains. Elsewhere, the Joshu adds that for this reason, the Turks place a golden wolf's head on top of their standards so that they do not forget their origins. So that's kind of werewolf adjacent. They have wolf ancestry, but they don't actually have the attributes of the werewolves. A second version of this origin myth is found in the same text, and says that the chief of this tribe was named Abangbu, and that he had 17 brothers. All of them were stupid and slow-witted, except for the one named Yiji Nishido, who was born of a she-wolf. Yiji Nishido was also said to have been touched by a spirit, and had the power to summon wind and rain. When the tribe was attacked by their neighbours, only he managed to escape, and he went on to marry the daughters of the summer and the winter gods. One of them had 4 children by them, including a man who could turn himself into a swan, and their descendants went on to form the Ashina clan. So again, werewolf adjacent. We don't see any signs of people transforming into wolves, or of wolves with human-like attributes. There does, however, exist another tale from the 8th century Tibetan document, known as the manuscript Peliet Tibetan 1283, which contains creatures that are a little closer to what we would recognise as werewolves, though they are described as dogs in the text. Apparently the word, though, is kind of like it could be dogs or it could be wolves. This document presents the report of a group of Uyghur emissaries who are also travelling into the Turkish Asian heartlands, and at one point the report breaks off to give us this legend. It tells us that beyond a great mountain chain, there are 2 tribes of the King of Heaven. The King of Bukor tried to lead his army in this direction, but they could not pass. 2 men of this army were wandering about, and they found the tracks of a female camel. They followed the tracks, and they found a herd of female camels and a woman near some water. The woman made them hide with her, at which point a group of dogs that had been chasing game came down to the water. The dogs sniffed the man and the woman out with their noses, and they prostrated themselves before the pack. The dogs then very kindly loaded up 10 camels with water and provisions, and sent the men back to the lands of the Turk. We are told that the first of these dogs was sent down from heaven. Here it miraculously split into 2, a red dog and a black dog, and that they again mated with a she-wolf. She soon proved to be unfit for producing offspring, however, so instead they abducted a maiden from a Turkic household to be their mate. Whilst all the resulting female children were human, all the male children were born as dogs or wolves, and together they formed 2 tribes descended from the red and the black dog, respectively. So we're getting closer there. We have dogs that have some human-like attributes. There is, however, one that comes very close to a werewolf, if only briefly. Sticking with the same region, in the secret history of the Mongols, which was composed in an unknown period of the 13th century, after the death of Chinggis Khan, better known to Western audiences as Genghis Khan. In this document, one of his ancestors is also said to have miraculously mated with a dog or wolf-like entity, giving him a similar sort of ancestry to the Ashina clan from the Turkic Khaganate. This ancestor was the woman Alan the Fair. After her husband, Dobun the Marksman, had passed away, Alan bore 3 sons, Bugu Chatagi, Buatu Salji, and Bondakar the Simple. When they grew up, these sons would talk behind Alan's back, implying that she had been unfaithful with the only other man who lived in their ger or yurt. Hearing of this, Alan gathers them together along with her 2 earlier sons by Dobun. Here she explains that every night before her later 3 sons were born, a shining yellow man would appear as a bright light through the smoke hole of the yurt. He would lie with her and stroke her belly, and then his brilliance would dissolve into her womb. Afterwards, he would crawl out of the ger the same way, via the beams of the sun, and in doing so, he would turn into a yellow dog or wolf. Similarly, earlier in the story, the first ancestor of Chinggis Khan's clan was said to be a blue-grey wolf who had descended from heaven in a similar fashion to the Tibetan story that we discussed before, and who mated with a fallow deer. So, clearly this motif of descent from wolves amongst royal figures was a fairly common one throughout the region during that time. If I'm being completely honest, the next wolf-related story I have has little to nothing to do with werewolves, but it's about a type of monstrous wolf that I found interesting. Again, there's no way we'll have another chance to talk about it, and it's my podcast and no one can stop me. So I thought I'd include this one here just to kind of round out kind of Europe and also moving a little bit into the Americas, because this story comes from Greenland. So this is something I think I stumbled across because it was a related article on a Wikipedia page to do with werewolves, and it is a monster in Greenlandic Inuit legend known as the Amarok, which is very much a wolf-related creature. Literally the only source I can find on it that seems legit is a mid-19th century work by a man named Heinrich Rink, who was a Danish geologist and ethnologist who spent 2 decades surveying large parts of the inland Greenland, and who was also a colonial administrator in the cities of Nuuk and Qaqortoq. Nuuk, sorry, here's Nuuk. I actually wrote down here it's Nuuk. I'm not going to go into the treatment today of the indigenous Greenlanders by the Danish authorities here, as my understanding is it's grim in the way that most European colonialism was, and I don't want to bog us down. but by what accounts I could find, Rink was a man who genuinely cared about Inuit Greenlanders, who founded one of the two major Greenlandic language newspapers. Okay, here I go. I'm going to try and say the name of it correctly. Atuagag Deleated. Atuagag Deleated. Okay, fourth try lucky. And apparently, when he was in office, he did try to involve Greenlanders in their own administration more than previous people had. My impression, though, is that this was done in very much kind of a paternalist way of caring for people. For example, in the foreword to the book that I'm going to cite, he describes them as primitives, which is one of those things where you're not sure if it's like patronizing or it's just the terminology people used at the time. And he also described them as an example of prehistoric man.
Oh, wow.
Which is much worse. This is very close to how ethnographers would describe people like Aboriginal Australians in the similar period of time. I discussed that a bit in my cave art video from a few months back. He's the sort of guy I'm like, doesn't seem like a bad guy. It just like seems to just naturally have had some of the prejudices of his time. So in his work, Tales and Traditions of the Eskimo, with a sketch of their habits, religion, language, and other peculiarities, Rink describes the Amarok as a gigantic grey wolf, big enough that it could carry a fully grown deer in its jaws. In other Inuit cultures and languages, it apparently was a word that was simply used to mean any big wolf, but amongst the Greenlanders that he had contact with, it was used to refer specifically to this more fabulous creature. So despite its fearsome appearance, the Amarok appears to have been a benign or even helpful entity when treated with respect, that can understand human speech and that exhibits magical powers. When it's angered, though, as often occurs in these tales, it can be a pretty fearsome foe. So the first of two tales that I'm going to detail today shows the more positive side of this creature. This story is called Kagsaksuk, and apparently was widespread enough that Rink found 9 different versions, including some that also came from the Labrador peoples in modern Canada. The Inuit peoples of Labrador and modern Canada, I should say. In this tale, an extremely small orphan boy named Kagsaksuk lived in a household full of mean men. His foster mother was a miserable old woman, and they lived together in a shed that adjoined the doorway or passage that led into the main living room of the house. The boy did not dare even to enter the shed, and he instead lived with the dogs in the passageway. On mornings, the men would rouse the dogs with their whips, and often they would strike Kagsaksuk as well. Sometimes the little boy would peek over the threshold of the main room to watch the men feast, and when he did so, the men would stick their fingers in his nostrils and lift him up, causing them to be the only part of him that would grow. My impression from this story is that he is literally like diminutive, like tiny, like he can just like barely peek over a step sort of thing. So his foster mother managed to get him some boots and a small spear that matched his size so that he might go out and play with the other children. Unfortunately, though, they also treated him cruelly, covering him with filth and filling his clothes up with snow. Over time, Kagsaksuk started to go and hide in solitary parts of the mountains where he would brood over how to grow strong. Using an invocation he remembered from his stepmother, he stood between 2 mountains and said, "Lord of strength, come forth. Lord of strength, come to me." An Amarok appeared before him, and Kagsaksuk was so frightened that he turned and ran. The Amarok easily caught up with the boy and wrapped its tail around him, then threw him to the ground. There the boy heard a rustling sound and saw a number of seal bones falling out of his body. The Amarok said, "It is because of these bones that thy growth has stopped." The creature wound its tail around him and threw him down again, and more seal bones fell from his body. The 3rd time, all the remaining bones fell from his body, and by the 5th time the Amarok tried to throw him down, he did not fall at all. On returning home, he let the other kids continue to bully him, not revealing what had happened, and each day he returned to the Amarok to undergo the same process. Eventually then, the autumn came, and one day the men in their skin canoes brought home a huge piece of driftwood that was too heavy to carry home. After night fell, Kagsaksuk ran down to the piece of driftwood and used his newfound strength to carry it to the house, where he buried it deep in the ground. The next day, everyone marvelled at the feat, wondering who had the great strength to do it. Still, Kagsaksuk pretended to be weak and allowed the children to mistreat him. When the ice began to melt in summer, 3 bears menaced the town, and no one was brave enough to go out and face them. Kagsaksuk asked to borrow his foster mother's shoes, and she mockingly threw them at him, telling him to fetch her 2 new skins whilst he was at it. To the other people's amazement, the boy went out to the 2 bears, grabbed each of them by their paws, and smashed them against an iceberg. Which actually is quite an evocative image, like someone just going, whoop, there you go.
That's an impressive feat.
Yeah. When he returned, all the people of the house were nice to him, allowing him into the main room of the house, and competed to provide him with food, clothing, and water. Now, this is where the tale takes quite a dark turn, although it's kind of more like a here are your just desserts type of darkness. So unfortunately for all these people, Kagsaksuk remembered their cruelty towards him. After the meal was over, a girl brought him water, and he at first thanked her, and then he seized her and squeezed her so hard that she burst.
That makes an example of somebody.
Yeah. Each time he saw someone in the group who had mistreated them, he did the same, grabbing them and squeezing them until they burst, or by tearing their limbs off. The parents, however, of these people that he did this to all approved, noting each time that they were good for nothing. In the end, he only spared those who had been nice to him. Later, he took one of the kayaks, taught himself how to use it, and toured the country showing off his great strength. In closing, we are told that he performed many great deeds in his life, and that in the 19th century, when these tales were being collected, it was claimed that the remains of both his house and his bear trap could still be seen.
But did he ever get those 2 skins for his foster mother?
Well, I don't think his foster mother ever gets... I think he actually does come back and throw the skins at her.
Yeah.
I'd missed out that element. So the second story I have is much shorter, and it highlights the dangers of angering the Amarok. It is simply titled The Amarok. In it, we are told that a man who was mourning the death of a relative went out to try and find some excitement. He found out that an Amarok had been heard roaring north of the town of Nuuk, and he took a relative with him to go and find it. Here he stumbled across the beast's young, who he slew without mercy. His companion, however, became frightened, and the 2 of them fled to a nearby cave. From their hiding place, they saw the Amarok returning with a reindeer in its mouth. The beast could not find its young, so instead it ran off to a nearby lake and pulled out what looked to them like a human shape. The relative then turned to look at the man who had slain the creature's young, but as he watched, the man dropped dead on the spot, for the creature had just pulled out his soul. So there are a few other tales in that same document that talk about the Amarok, but in most cases they present the Amarok more as like a great beast that is like a feat to have slain, rather than having much in the way of interaction with them. So, whilst I said that I'm not going to be discussing Native American concepts that have sometimes been equated to werewolves by Europeans, or at least not today, there are examples of where the European idea of the werewolf has been exported to parts of the Americas and the Caribbean, and variants of it have become part of the local folklore. Unsurprisingly, the various names of these creatures appear to have been derived from the French loup-garou, considering the history of French colonialism in the area. So to round us off, I thought it would be fun to discuss 3 of these creatures in their different areas. There are a few more of these, but I just didn't have the time to get to them in my prep for this. So with the exception of the first one, I couldn't find much info on these, but I thought it would be nice to mention the few details that I could. The first story I have concerns the loup-garou of French Canada. Here, according to a 2015 article titled The Changing Shape of the Shapeshifter, the French-Canadian loup-garou, by Professor Amy J. Ransom, a distinguishing feature of the werewolf here is that it is explicitly a Catholic entity, I should say. Specifically, people are condemned by the devil to become a ravenous werewolf each night if they have not said confession or gone to Mass for 7 years, or if they have made fun of the curate or failed to attend Christmas Mass or not paid their tithe. This wolf walks on either 2 legs or 4, and can be delivered from their curse by having someone draw a small quantity of blood without killing them. These tales usually take place on remote hunting and trapping expeditions, or at lumber camps, and usually their casts are exclusively male as a result. So the story I've selected is a good example of this, and it is the 1899 tale Une Histoire de Loup-garou, which is by a man whose name I'm going to struggle to pronounce, Louvigny de Montigny, something like that. And I'm using a translation again provided by Professor Amy J. Ransom. This tale is narrated by a hunting guide named Joseph Noel, who tells us that several years ago he sought out shelter in an abandoned chanquière, or logging site. In the darkness of the cabin, he and his dog, Bula, or Boulay, I think it might be, hears something grunting and groaning alongside them, that rolled on the floor and laughed and cried. He beheld a monstrous beast with a bear's body, a long tail, and fiery glowing eyes. Joseph shot the beast in self-defense, only for it to cry out, "You killed me, Joseph Noel! You killed me! Oh God, forgive me!" Joseph recognized the voice as that of a wicked man named Titoin Porto, who had refused to do his Easter duties for 7 years and had turned into a werewolf on Lent. So the next of these beasts I want to briefly mention is the Loup-garou or Rougarou, which is a variant of the werewolf that apparently appears in oral traditions throughout the Louisiana Cajun Creole diaspora. I was again on some real shaky ground with this one, as whilst there are a number of websites that discuss these supposed traditions, there appears to have been very little in the way of discussion of this entity by folklorists. I did find one random website that mentioned that a local an interview of a local folklorist who was like, yeah, they are a thing in local folklore. Then he gave no further details, and I've forgotten his name. So, oh well. Literally the only major details I could find all came from Wikipedia and some random tourist websites that want to promote the legend. So take all of this with the biggest pinch of salt that you can find. I'm really just throwing this in here for the sake of interest. Basically, this creature is said to be a version of the werewolf that prowls swamps, sugarcane fields, and woodlands, that is sometimes said to have a human body, but the head of a wolf or a dog. This beast is said to track down and kill Catholics who have not observed Lent, so again similar to the French-Canadian loup-garou that we mentioned before. However, it has one weakness, which is that when a person is transformed into a loup-garou, they lose the ability to count beyond 12. So if you place 13 small items outside your door, you'll be forced to try and count them until dawn, when it must flee. This sounds an awful lot like the old Eastern European trick of stopping a vampire by leaving out grains that it will be forced to count. There's also a few other variants of these creatures found throughout Louisiana, listed in Professor Teresa Bain's Encyclopedia of Vampire Mythology, and these do appear to have much more solid sourcing behind them. The most interesting of these is the loup-garou, which is a variant creature, and it instead reads like a combination of the werewolf with a vampire and also Bigfoot, and also another element that I'm going to get to in a second. So it is described as a 7-foot-tall hairy biped, and has sickly yellow eyes set wide apart in its head. This creature was once a child that became lost in the swamp, or who was abandoned there, and who in a incredibly southern US version of the Romulus and Remus myth was raised by an alligator.
Was he the original Florida man?
Possibly. He carries the spirit of Florida man either way. This creature lives in the deep parts of the swamp that are only accessible by boat. It occasionally returns to civilization to feed on the blood of people or livestock. So, my final couple of creatures I want to mention today come from Haiti. The first is the Haitian variant of the loup-garou, and comes to us from the work Voodoo in Haiti by Alfred Métro, who was a major 20th century ethnographer of Southern America and the Caribbean. In his work, he describes the loup-garou as the name used in the capital of Port-au-Prince for a variant type of criminal sorcerer that is elsewhere known as a zobop. Some of these sorcerers possess an ability known as a werewolf point that allows them to turn into a variety of animals, not just wolves, but it also includes pigs, cows, black cats, or horses. A few of these practitioners take up this art willingly, but most are unknowingly tricked into it by consorting with other werewolves. In another similarity to the Catholic aspect of the French-Canadian and Cajun loup-garou, it is also said that certain Loa, is that how it's pronounced? I can't remember from our
I think that's how we pronounced it last time. I will not attest to its accuracy.
Okay, fair enough.
I was going with best guess at the time as well.
Loa, or spirits, are also known to confer this power upon women who have neglected their duties towards them. A newborn werewolf created in this fashion commits its crimes unknowingly, going on nocturnal excursions to commit cannibalism that the person remembers only as bad dreams. By the time they realize the truth, it is too late, as the hunger for human flesh has become too strong to break. These creatures seek to create more of their own, and they usually do so by tricking women into fraternizing with them until they have learned the secret of their art. Luckily, though, there are a few ways for people to defend themselves against these creatures. One way to prevent them from preying on children is for the mother to drink bitter coffee laced with sugarcane spirit during pregnancy, after which she and later the baby are washed in a bath infused with many spices and leaves. The child is also passed through a fire made of burning sugarcane spirit, and the person performing this ritual asks it 3 times, "Who wants this little one?" To which the mother replies, "I do." This quote-unquote spoils the children's blood for the werewolf, and any creature that tries to feed on them will be forced to throw up violently. So think that one scene in What We Do in the Shadows where Nick tries to eat a chip with fairly explosive results. There are also a great many other abilities prescribed to these figures that more heavily resemble those of vampires, and as such I've not chosen to go into them today. If you do want to know more though, maybe go read the relevant parts of voodoo in Haiti. And before we go on to our final creatures, we're going to have one last break so you all have a chance to listen to these adverts by such fine products and services that support this show. Enjoy. On top of this, there also exists a variant creature in Haiti known as the Jet Rouge that has aspects of both a werewolf and a vampire. According to Alfred Mitreau, the Jet Rouge is an evil devil and cannibal that he directly equates with werewolves. According to Jacques Desargent's book Voodoo, this name means "I who am red" or "the red one," whilst other sources such as Professor Teresa Bain's Encyclopedia of Vampire Mythology describes it simply as meaning red-eyed. To me it sounds like just the red one or something.
Yeah, I mean, I assume the J is the same as like Je m'appelle, my name is.
Yeah,
so
I am red.
I'm red.
Yeah, I think that's the first one then. Yeah. According to her description, the Jet Rouge is the reanimated body of an evil person who after their death has risen from the grave in the form of a blood-sucking wolf. Again, quite similar to vampires, but it has a unique way of being killed. The only way to slay this creature is to behead it with a new gravedigger's shovel, after which point its head must be thrown in a river. I'm also aware that I think in the same area there is another creature called a loup-garou, which is like a skinless hag, who again comes a lot closer to a vampire, as far as I can tell. And with that, that's all the folkloric figures that I could find that seem to resemble some sort of wolf that's out there. Turns out that the werewolf transformation is much more of a European thing, or in some cases influenced by other beliefs, but still kind of rooted in folklore that French people and German people have exported elsewhere. And with that, Cassie, I'm going to hand over to you for our final section, which is going to touch on an element we haven't really talked about. We've mentioned it, we haven't really gone into detail yet, which is there is, alongside this folkloric element, there is this kind of more medical idea of lycanthropy, which you're going to talk about for us.
Yes, it's a psychological condition, not a physical one. We've not abandoned all scientific integrity and claiming shapeshifters exist. So I've kept this section quite short, and as I mentioned at the start, I'll give a content warning for the whole thing, as it will include talking about hallucinations, delusions, symptoms of psychosis, body dysmorphia, sleep disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and assorted related symptoms, triggers, risk factors, and treatments. So if that's too heavy, or if that risks getting into a specific trigger for you, we completely understand people ducking out at this point, as this is our final section today.
Yeah.
So we'll say goodbye now to anyone who wishes to skip this bit, and hopefully see you all next time for our episode on Aztecs,
Yes.
which I'm quite looking forward to.
We didn't have like a smart way of hinting at Aztecs, because it's like all the stuff that we could think of was like people's misconceptions what the Aztecs actually are. So like, no, sorry, it's just going to be Aztecs, folk.
We're just
It'll be an overview of Aztec mythology.
We're just saying it. But before that, for those who don't stick around for this bit, I will give an explanation of what clinical lycanthropy is. So, clinical lycanthropy refers to the psychiatric condition of a persistent belief that one has or can turn into a werewolf. It is a subset of what's called clinical zoanthropy, the belief that one has or can turn into an animal, of any animal, a condition which is observed throughout the world. The specific manifestations of zoanthropy vary quite a bit by continent and culture, and can include delusions of transforming into lions, tigers, hyenas, sharks, and crocodiles.
Oh my.
Which have been documented. I was going to leave that one out, but yeah. I was being serious, Charles. And lycanthropy in particular is mostly limited to Europe and North America. So I think the best way here to convey how clinical lycanthropy presents is to take one of the modern case reports, a report from Dr. Rajit Shrestha of Northfield, Ohio, in the Journal of Psychiatry and Clinical Neuroscience in 2014. Dr. Shrestha describes a 20-year-old man who was admitted for prolonged agitated and erratic behaviour lasting more than 1 month. He had a family history of bipolar disorder and was diagnosed to be undergoing the onset of psychosis. Following his admission, he began to display increasingly animalistic tendencies, which included howling like a wolf and crawling or attempting to run on all fours in the hallway. He confessed that he believed he was a werewolf and that he periodically transformed into a wolf. He also claimed he had received visions of the devil, who had chosen him for some special reason. His family would later inform his clinician that he had been increasingly preoccupied with werewolf books and movies before the initial symptoms and the episode of animalistic behaviour came on. Dr. Shrestha identified these symptoms as what's called delusional misidentification of the self, a concept that I'll explain more shortly, and treated him with an antipsychotic. Over time, his animalistic behaviours became less frequent and eventually disappeared, and his belief that he was a werewolf faded. The first case study of this kind, of lycanthropy in a psychiatric context, goes all the way back to 1852.
Oh, that's earlier than I thought, yeah.
Yeah, published by Dr. Charles Morrell in his book Études cliniques. He describes a man admitted to his clinic in Nancy, in France, who was convinced that he had transformed into a wolf, and he attempted to demonstrate that he was a wolf by showing the doctor his supposed wolf's teeth, showing his supposedly cloven feet, and his extensive body hair. He claimed that he only wanted to eat raw meat, but he refused to do so when offered a plate, as it was not rotten enough. He demanded to be taken to the forest and shot, but was instead placed in an asylum, where he eventually sadly died of starvation. His recorded diagnosis was lycanthropy, and he is the only patient between then and 2020, which is the latest paper I can find, where lycanthropy was the diagnosis rather than listed as a symptom of schizophrenia, psychosis, mania, or another condition.
Yeah.
Including this case, the review by researchers at Université Hôpital Cochin list 20 cases of lycanthropy, 4 cases of what they call partial lycanthropy, so believing one has partially transformed into a wolf, so 24 cases total up to 2020. In addition to this, they also list 19 cases of kynanthropy, so the belief that one has transformed into a dog. After the unfortunate case of Morrell's patient, the majority of these patients received proper treatment and went into remission or partial remission. The only other case in the 19th century, case in Spain in 1859, was that of a multiple murderer who claimed that he had shapeshifted into a werewolf when he committed his crimes. He was diagnosed with psychopathy rather than psychosis, and so was able to stand trial for his crimes and was sentenced to death. Since then, most cases were able to identify lycanthropy or kynanthropy as a symptom of schizophrenia, psychosis, or mania, and the patients were given the appropriate treatment. So, what is going on when a person with one of these conditions believes they are a werewolf? The review's authors put forward a few explanations based on the cases they identified. The first is a concept called senesthopathy. This is a symptom that can be distinct from other conditions such as schizophrenia, but is found as a presentation of schizophrenia or psychotic depression. And it's a disruption to one's sense of self-existence and their connection with their body. So this leads to sensory hallucinations in how the body is perceived, so altering the perceptions of body size, body shape, skeletal structure, skin, hair, etc. In one of the case reviews, a schizophrenia patient originally from Morocco was described as suffering from senesthopathy when he believed he had undergone increased hair growth, hardening of his jaw and facial muscles for increased strength like a predator, and the presence of long canine teeth. So, from these hallucinations, he believed that he was undergoing transformation into a werewolf. The reviewers used this example to show that when lycanthropy presents in this fashion, the sensory hallucinations are the main symptom, and the belief that one is a werewolf is due to attempts to interpret and rationalize these delusions. A second explanation is a variant of what is called delusional misidentification syndrome, which I mentioned earlier. The typical presentation of these syndromes is in developing a fixed, false belief about an individual's identity, either believing that a person one is close to has been replaced by an imposter, or that a stranger in the person's environment is a familiar person in disguise. This can involve the delusion of seeing the person transform before their eyes, seeing the disguise slip, or seeing through the disguise that is present. How this can relate to clinical lycanthropy is in a specific presentation of DMS, where the person they see as the imposter is their own reflection. This was observed in 2 of the cases of lycanthropy covered by the reviewers, in which the patients saw the physical transformation occurring when looking in the mirror. In some patients, there was also an overlap between misidentification of the self and others, such as one sufferer of kynanthropy who also believed his wife and daughters were transforming into dogs. There was also evidence of overlap between lycanthropy or kynanthropy and belief that others, including their psychiatrist in one case, were imposters. So, both of these explanations are suggested to involve a dysfunction of the belief evaluation system, which is essentially the system in the brain which identifies whether an observation of the world fits into one's understanding of the world. So, this was hypothesized based on 2 observations. One, that many sufferers only exhibit one single delusion, so believing that they are transforming into a wolf, and the fact that each different type of delusion, that of imposters, that of transformation, that of loss of self, etc., each of these originates in a different region of the brain. So, there's no explanation why each individual with different presentations of the delusion could incorporate their separate delusions into their reality if each delusion had a different origin. So this became known as the 2-factor theory of delusion, and the second factor after the initial delusion itself is thought to be a region called the right lateral prefrontal cortex. So this is responsible for integrating what we receive from external senses like vision and what is processed internally, so stored memories, for example. And so essentially it relates the observation of the world with the information that we already know. If this process is not functioning properly in lycanthropy, then that means that a sufferer may have knowledge that shape-shifting is physically impossible, but they're not able to integrate that knowledge with the false sensory input of seeing or feeling themselves changing, and so the experience doesn't get labelled as false and the delusion persists. One other important aspect of clinical lycanthropy to discuss is that in several examples identified by the researchers, the patients did believe that their transformation was triggered by the full moon. So researchers Thomas Erin and Philip Lewis of University Hospital Cologne hypothesized a physical effect of the moon. However, to me, their hypothesis is shaky at best.
Yeah, I think that's more like, I think it's more a psychological thing of like that, understanding that that is an element of werewolves from popular culture and just incorporating that into the delusion.
Yeah, their hypothesis relies on it relies on the assumption of something completely undiscovered yet. So they suggest either an undiscovered system in which some humans can react to magnetism from the lunar cycle, which we don't have any evidence that humans will react to that. The idea that there might be a toxin produced by a plant that these people have been exposed to, whose growth is affected by the lunar cycle. Again, no evidence there.
Especially if someone's like a psychiatric institution that does not have this plant. It's like, why would it still happen then?
Yep. Or that moonlight affects the sleep rhythms of certain people, which, again, the prevalence of artificial light, particularly for the people who have already been admitted and are still showing symptoms, makes changes in moonlight negligible at most. They do also rely on a paper about the supposed effect of the lunar cycle on bipolar disorder, but this paper appears to try and force the data to fit its hypothesis. In fact, most of the people experiencing a monthly cycle in their bipolar disorder were menstruating women.
Right.
And nobody thought of that.
It does that, yeah, okay. I can see why no one thought of it, unfortunately.
Having done studies which involve menstruating women, I know that many people, many other researchers, don't take that into account.
No.
It's a big problem in research. And apparently affected these people's hypothesis of bipolar disorder. It's not good. In short, I'm not convinced.
Yeah.
I'll get off that soapbox about research on women.
I mean, it just is, it's a simple fact, like women's medical complaints are treated less seriously by doctors. Statistically, there's good evidence of that. Like,
yep. Yeah. And by researchers, a lot of research tends to be on university-aged young men.
Yeah.
And so when they do actually have women in their case studies, no one thinks, let's check about the menstrual cycles.
Yeah. I was part of a large-scale study that was looking at unrelated hormones to that. But we did actually, we had like these big statistical tables of details about all the patients that had been collected over years. And we did actually have noted down, was this person menstruating when these blood samples were taken, etc. And I think they did try and compensate for that statistically in the end. So it can be done, is what I'm trying to say.
I mean, I was involved in a study on menstruating women with MRI, and like we're looking at the literature, and it's like, there's nothing here to put in our introduction.
Yeah, it's like we are inventing a thing. We're not inventing. We are setting the foundation for this in this study, this field going forwards.
To go back to lycanthropy and the moon, to get off that soapbox, the more convincing explanation of the lunar cycle affecting clinical lycanthropy is the idea of culture affecting the delusion. In the Western world, the full moon is now very strongly associated with the popular idea of werewolves.
Yeah, it's werewolves, witches, general spooky goings on.
Yeah, exactly. For a long time, it has also been part of beliefs about witches for even longer than werewolves, I think. The fact that lycanthropy is mostly limited to Europe and North America, where all of this history and culture comes from, is also a strong indicator that it's an effect of culture on this type of delusion. Further support of this that the review gives, they mention that the cases of kynanthropy, belief that one is transforming into a dog, are only seen in the Arabic world, and mention that there has historically been an association of dogs with impurity and the unclean in pre-Islamic beliefs. Though Islamic beliefs did have started to change that, so there were like stories about Muhammad adopting dogs and treating dogs as being creatures of God. So it is an older, association there. This is, of course, not to dismiss the idea of lycanthropy or conditions such as manic depression being affected by the phase of the moon, simply to mean that the most likely explanation is the fictional association creating a trigger for the individual. I'd say that's about as detailed a summary of clinical lycanthropy that will fit into the remit of the show today. So I think it is time to bring this exploration of werewolves to a close.
Yes, I think it'll be like, nearly 5 hours or so, I think, total when this is edited down of covering werewolves. So I think we've done our due diligence here in terms of going into depth. But yes, folks, thank you very much for listening to us. The thing about us having done 30-something episodes is that I also have not figured out, means I've also not yet figured out a way to do an outro for these episodes.
You got to plug stuff.
Yeah, I got a bunch of stuff to plug first. Okay, so if you're listening to this podcast over on audio platforms, you can always head over to YouTube on the channel The Histocrat to find a video version of this episode that will probably come out a couple of weeks after the original audio version comes out. And where you can find all sorts of different visual aids to help give some bit more context to what we're saying. And if you're listening to it over on YouTube on the Histocrat channel, you can always listen to this on audio platforms as well. We're on Spotify and we're on iTunes/Apple Podcasts under the title of Mythillogical. So yeah, if you want to check out and listen to it in a different format, those are the places to go. If you want to support the show a little bit further, you can always head on over to patreon.com/thehistocrat. Where you can get access to ad-free versions of the audio version of this show. And if you want, you can also become a member over on the Histocrat channel, and that also gives you ad-free versions of the video versions of the podcast. I think it's ad-free anyway. I don't put any ads on them. I think YouTube does an annoying thing now where they might put ads on anyway, and I just don't get any money from those adverts, which is not great for everyone involved, basically. If you've been watching in the last couple of months, you may also have noticed there was a period where the adverts on the channel may have gone completely insane, like every 4 or 5 minutes. And YouTube is because YouTube did a thing on the back end where they swapped. I think we mentioned like we were going to stop doing specific ad breaks because of that for this podcast. And YouTube like did a thing where they swapped it so that for new channels, if you turn mid-roll ads on in any fashion, they just take it over and they can put ads wherever they want. I thought that was also true for older channels, but it turns out I still, as a legacy creator, have the ability to fix that. So that should have been fixed now. You should not be seeing adverts every 3 minutes on videos, which it sounds a bit insufferable to me. But I think that's everything that we need to plug, everything we need to clarify. And
superstition.
Oh, yeah. No, we did at the beginning.
Oh, yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Go check it out anyway.
Yeah. Alongside those, go and check out Folklore and Superstition. It's on the same feed as this for the audio platforms, and it's over on the Folklore and Superstition channel over on YouTube as well. And with that, I'm trying to think of a nice, interesting way to end this.
Don't go out tonight. There's a bad moon on the rise.
Yeah. When is the next full moon?
I don't know. I didn't know last time.
No, we are professionals. Anyway, stay safe, folks, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Bye.